So why don't we get started? Why don't you tell us who you are, how you got started on this whole writing thing, and kind of take us on that timeline.
Yeah, my name is David Hopkins, and my writing path it sort of goes every which way but a straight line. And so, anyone who tells you there's more than one way to get into writing, there's actually you can also do five or six different ways all at the same time, and then see where you end up. I started off actually working in comics. I was a comic book writer, and gosh, this was around 2001. I used to say 20 years ago, but now it's more than 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I was writing comic book scripts. I was working with artists. After a few years, I did get picked up by a small press publisher, Viper Comics. I did a lot of anthology work, some with Image, some with Oni, a few other places here and there. After about 8 years or so of working in comics, which I loved, I also decided that I kind of liked writing for myself and not having to collaborate with an illustrator. Who illustrators are awesome, but it's also they're two very different timelines. And so I started doing more journalism. I was writing for magazines, which paid a lot better. I was able to do that full time for a while. And then I kind of hopped back to my first love, which was fantasy fiction. And then for the past few years now, I've been writing fantasy novels. So I've had my toe in a lot of different things, but this is the thing that I'm going to try to stay the course with for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, that's pretty cool to go from comics to. Do you ever think you'd go back to doing comics at all at any point, or?
Yeah, actually, the funny thing about it is comics, like any other field, is tremendously hard to break into. And I should say it differently. If you want to just make comics, the entry level is very easy, much like indie writing, indie publishing. You can, back in the day, if you had a long arm stapler and a printer, you could make your own comics. You could go to a comic book shop or a convention, you could sell your own books. And that's certainly how I started off. But to get into that higher level where you're writing for Marvel and DC, and I have friends who have broken into those companies, it's a whole other level of difficulty. I found that probably the best way to get into comics is to establish yourself in a field outside of comics. We've
Mm-hmm.
had some really great novelists who have done work in comics. We have great screenwriters, TV writers, playwrights who have all found success in the comic book field. So it's one of those things where the outsider kind of builds their name. They almost have a better reputation than someone who's been in the trenches for a while. So this is not a long con to get back into comics. But if
Mm-hmm.
ever Marvel came up to me and asked if I had a Fantastic Four story, I would say absolutely. I've been sitting on it for about 20
Mm-hmm.
years now. I would love to write that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's cool. Do do you find that yeah, I think that's true of a lot of things, but especially it feels like the comic book industry, especially with like the big two, that's got to be just a highly competitive, not only highly competitive, but then there's also very well-known names that are like entrenched in writing good stories. And so yeah, I can definitely see how that's like can just be could be really tough to break into.
Well, yeah, and I would say it's even more competitive for comic book writers. I mean, obviously, the skills required to be an illustrator is monumental, and the work that they do is absolutely incredible. But because the burnout rate is what it is among artists, there is a whole bench of people waiting to come in if that person is not able to fulfill what they need to do. Whereas writers, it's different. A writer could work on 10 different titles for a
Hmm.
company, and they're not going to burn out because you can write a comic book script about one a week. And I know people who could probably work even faster than that, but one a week I think is perfectly reasonable for a 24-page comic book. You could do several of them a month, and some of these comic book writers will be with that company for 20 plus years.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, because of the way that American comics are structured, The artists tend to get chewed up and spit out. The burnout rate. If there's an artist who's been with a company for decades, they are few and far between. They are legends in their field. Most of them will work on a comic for a while and then they'll need a break. But the writers, a lot more competitive. And on top of that, if you get a well-known author, let's say like a Lee Bardugo, who is writing Six of Crows and stuff like that, if she is offered a comic book, the sales are automatically guaranteed just because she'll bring her fan base over. Where if you've got a person who's relatively an unknown in the comic book industry, they bring no one over. But it's interesting because you are essentially a curator for characters and ideas that have been around for years and years and years and years and years. So when you're writing, let's say, Superman, you are not just writing a new and different Superman. You are adding to a lore that dates back almost 100 years. And part of what you're trying to do is appease a very devoted fan base who knows absolutely everything about Superman. And you're also trying to find where you can add to the mythology in a meaningful way. So it's fascinating, but it's also very limiting. Whereas, working on, say, my book, I'm creating the mythos as I go. I'm getting to make all the decisions about who these characters are, what's important, what's not important. I'm not stuck in Smallville or having to retell the same stories. So, but at the same time, there's also, millions of people that would love to read a great Superman story. In the world of indie publishing, the margins are much, much slimmer.
Yeah. Well, I would say too, I don't go reading, I love Batman and all that kind of stuff, but I don't go reading that for every story to be groundbreaking or new or, I get it. It's Batman against Joker. It's the same thing we've been doing forever. So there's that, but then there's also, that fan base is like, you got to figure out how to add to the lore in a meaningful way. But if you do it wrong, they're going to chew you up and spit you out,
Yeah, there's a few people. I think Gail Simone, Tom King, people like Jonathan Hickman in the world of comics who are absolutely amazing, and they're very good at that. But one thing I figured out very quickly when I was doing indie comics is when I've got my little indie comic book and they come to my table, most of the people going to those comic book conventions, let's say they're a Spider-Man fan, that fandom of Spider-Man does not extend over to just anything. They want the Spider-Man t-shirt, they want the Spider-Man sticker, they want Spider-Man art and more Spider-Man comics. That's all they want. So you're standing here with your little comic book. They just are not interested in it. The different thing is in the world of fantasy, a lot of the people that come to your table, they've already read Martin, they've already read Tolkien, they've already read, Isaac Asimov, they've read everybody. And so when they see your book, they're like, okay, it's fantasy, it's epic fantasy. It looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck. Sure, I'll give it a try.
Right.
And I have found it is a lot easier to sell an epic fantasy book at a book convention than it is to sell an indie comic at a comic book convention, just because the fantasy reader just wants more fantasy. They're fans of the genre. Whereas oftentimes within the comic book industry, they're fans of a very particular property. And they're not, it's harder to sell them on something that doesn't look like what they've grown up loving.
Yeah. Well, I'd say fantasy fans too. I mean, I like things that are, very similar to what I've read before, but I'm also looking for what's a new take or something that's a little, different. So yeah, I agree with you that they're looking for, I want more fantasy that's adjacent to, but I do want something new. And so that drives them to want to buy something that's, they don't know about.
Oh, absolutely. I have a friend, Sam Renner, who writes sci-fi that's very much like Star Wars. But what you find out very quickly is Star Wars fans are not looking for things that are like Star Wars. They just want Star Wars. And so he's more likely to find fans who are just hard sci-fi fans that are like, okay, it's a space opera with aliens and travel to distant planets, I'm sold. Let's do it.
Yeah, for sure. Do you think that your experience working in the comic book industry and like breaking in a bit and doing some of that, do you think that influenced you into wanting to self-publish your novels as
Oh,
opposed to attempting to query and stuff?
that is a great question, and it is absolutely the case because in the world of comics, it's different. I think that the book industry is catching up, but in the world of comics, the indie comic book creator is celebrated. They are
Hmm.
considered cool. They are doing their own thing. They're out there. You talk with anyone who is an established comic book creator, and they have nothing but respect for the indies, for the people who,
Hmm.
because a lot of them worked their way up from there. And I've been to San Diego Comic Con, having drinks and hanging out with some of the biggest names in the industry, and some of the people that I'm friends with are now, they're writing and illustrating for some of those great big comic book companies. And it's a lot more just sort of a organization of mutual respect.
Hmm.
Whereas I feel like it's taken a while for the indie book publisher to really gain acceptance in the larger publishing world. I think that, and there's a lot of valid reasons. I mean, part of it, is skepticism about the quality of the work,
Hmm.
wondering about, are you serious? Are you doing this, in a way that preserves the integrity of this thing that I love? And, book publishing, I think, has a lot more gatekeepers. And so there is a little bit more hesitancy, but you're now beginning to find more and more traditionally published authors who are looking at what indie authors are doing and saying, there might be something to that. In fact, I was at a convention just 2 weeks ago talking with a traditionally published author who does want to transition over to indie.
Hmm.
And part of the reason why is she has an idea that she just doesn't think will do well in a traditionally publishing market, but she thinks it'll do well in indie, and the margins are so much better. So
Hmm.
she's looking at those margins. And I've even talked with some people about, how their sales going, kind of what's going on with your book. And I'm finding that my book, it's not selling gangbusters, but it is outselling some traditionally published authors, people who are like mid-tier authors that, they got this small deal and they sent it out there, and they sold some books. But when we talk numbers, I go, yeah, my numbers are equal to or maybe even a little bit better, and I'm getting better margins, and I own my property, and I can control the other, the audio book and the ebook and the pricing and all that stuff. So I think that for some traditionally published authors, they look at what indie authors are doing, and it is kind of appealing. I mean, you talk about the success of someone like Orion Cahill, who
Hmm.
he's not going to tell you the exact numbers of what he's doing right now, but he's making a pretty good living off of
Hmm.
his indie books.